This is the Plagmanrules Podcast, right, everybody? Welcome to the Monday edition, and unfortunately, the date today is Monday, September 11th, and it is a very special day, to some people, and a very sad day to other people, of course. And full disclosure, I am recording this on Sunday night, first Plagman Rules podcast in a while. Sorry, guys, that it's been so long, but of course, we had the Labor Day holiday. I took off Friday morning, so I couldn't record on Friday. Then, of course, Monday, Labor Day itself, I actually got back, and as you can kind of tell in my voice, I really got a bad head cold, and I've actually been under the weather all week this week, and just really been miserable all the week, and my voice was really affected by that, and my voice was not great, and as you can tell, it's still not up to 100% yet, but it's, it's time to do a podcast, it's time to get the ball moving again, and maybe this will help the healing process a little bit, not to, go too far with it, but anyways, yeah, today is September 11th, and of course, we have to remember, obviously, what happened 16 years ago was just absolutely devastating to our country at the time. And of course, I don't want to devote a whole lot of time to this, but I think it is kind of irresponsible to not mention, of course, today, September 11th. And, just to kind of briefly share a story on that, I mean, I was in kindergarten when this happened, and I was actually probably just starting school at the time, because I'm in Central Time Zone, of course. Everything happened in the East Time Zone with everything that happened during 9/11. It was such an event where I was so young that I really didn't get everything. Of course, I was only about 5 years old, about to turn 6 years old, because my birthday is actually the beginning of October. So I was really more focused on, I'm about to turn 6 years old, I'm going to have a birthday party soon. I was not focused at all on the fact that America had changed forever for what it was going to do in the future, and how our dealings of the past have really just come back to bite us on the ass, because we just got 3,000 people. At the time, I think they were saying way more. The estimates, I think, initially were like 10,000 in the first few days. But that we just lost all these people, and that it is a really devastating event. So I really don't have any memory, because I was such a young kid. Yeah, I just felt like it is September 11th. It's a day we have to remember, a day that does bring so much sadness into so many people's lives. And it is a case where I have been watching a lot of documentaries lately about the 9/11 attacks, and it's just such a devastating thing to watch if you're somebody like me who really just didn't have that perspective, and who really didn't have the memory of the event itself and how I reacted to it, because I really didn't have much of a reaction, because I was too young to really settle everything and to know what the Twin Towers were, to know what the World Trade Center was, to know the significance of it, and to know, everything that happened at the Pentagon, everything that happened with United 93, and yeah, the movie helps with that a lot, because I eventually did see that. But it's just something I had to mention, kind of just briefly share a little bit about that. Luckily, I wanted to get that out of the way, and we can kind of get that. It's a very tragic thing that happened, but now we can move on to some greener pastures here, because, at least initially, because we do have some other news to talk about today. Now to some of the more regular programming here. So, of course, it's Monday, so we got to talk about the box office report. There was, nothing to talk about the previous week. Of course, I was off, for Labor Day weekend, but, it was the lowest box office in, the last 20 years, or roughly 20 years or 15 years. I've seen various reports, but we had, no major 1,000 plus theater wide releases going into effect. We had Tulip Fever, but that really fell apart and did not make a lot of money. And Hitman's Bodyguard has been number one for now 3 weeks in a row up until this current weekend. And, it's made a respectable amount of money, that movie has. But now we get into the big one. All right, now, I think everybody's been, in the past probably 3 or 4 weeks, really been hotly anticipating this movie. And of course, we're talking about the Stephen King adaptation of It. And I'll tell you what, I just saw the movie today as well. Again, today is Sunday when I'm recording this, so we don't have the final numbers in yet, but I went to see it here today, and I'll have a review up sometime later. I just got back from it, actually. As you might be able to tell, when I do reviews on the podcast here, I do like to have a written source that I read off of. I try not to make it so obvious, but sometimes it just is. But I have not written up an actual review of it yet, and I would rather review it and actually have my thoughts on it all come together when it's in a way where I can actually read them off. So, with that out of the way there, I can definitely tell you that I like the movie a lot, though. And I'll tell you what, just to give a little background here, I do like to watch box office predictions and try to get the box office numbers right. I actually do have a box office predictions that I do on movieblogger.com. You can look me up there if you want to look through. I've been doing it now for a little over a year, since last August. Actually, I remember it was Suicide Squad was where I started it. Through the past few months here, they originally predicted a $40 million opening for this movie, and that was clear back in the beginning of July, roughly 2 months before it opens is when the first predictions come out. So $40 million for a horror movie is in the echelon of some of the biggest horror openings of all time. And then as we get to like about 2 or 3 weeks ago, 50 million. And I was actually saying like a week before that, maybe 50 million. And I was going to say that's probably the tops there. It keeps going. Then we get to early last week, and the projections had been bumped up to about 70 million. And at that point, I'm starting to really freak out. I'm saying, holy crap. So that not only crushes the September opening weekend record, which is about 49 million, which was what the second Hotel Transylvania movie did, but that also comes close to breaking the record for a New Line film, because even though it is Warner Brothers and New Line both, New Line's record was the last Lord of the Rings movie, Return of the King, which opened to 72 million, a little over 72 million, and that was back in 2003. So if it can go a little above that, it's a new company record for New Line. And that's not including the Hobbit movies, by the way. You know, if you want to count those as co-production between Warner Brothers and New Line, then those came later and all that. But that was a standalone movie, and I kind of consider that the record, even though the Hobbit, the first one, did surpass it. But then we get to Thursday night, and I'm seeing some of the last predictions before the weekend actually begins. 81 million. I'm thinking, okay, now, if you want to include The Hobbit there as a New Line production, now that's reaching really, really high record projections there. And then Deadline, which is the site I really look to on the weekend and stuff, when the first numbers start coming in, first they said about 100 million. And that was Friday morning after the midnight numbers and midnight screenings and evening screenings had all come out. They were talking about 100 million. I was thinking, that's incredible. And I'm like, it's not going to go any higher than that. It is a horror movie, and horror movies do not do this well. So we're talking a major proportion here, a major epic win here for Warner Brothers and for New Line, for horror movies, for Stephen King adaptations, for September movies, for the box office itself, because it's been so on the ropes here the last month pretty much. And then we get to today, we'll just skip ahead, and a lot of the industry predictions are saying 117.1 million. And I'm also seeing a few estimates that are saying it could climb to as high as 124 million. Wow. Okay, now I thought the Oscar scandal that happened in February was going to be the biggest news story of the year. Now, and I don't want to make this sound like it is going to be remembered that way. This could be the one that tops it. This could be the biggest movie news story of the year, with maybe the exception, maybe when Star Wars comes out, maybe that makes even more money than we're anticipating, and maybe Justice League or Thor Ragnarok, a couple of these other really hotly anticipated projects coming up here in the next couple of months, or maybe Blade Runner 2049 really starts breaking some records too once we get to October. But this is such a high as far as the numbers go and everything. Never has a September movie ever dreamed of getting close to that $100 million mark, and it went over it. And it went over it in a significant margin. As a matter of fact, if we look at the record books here, it is second only to Deadpool as far as biggest R-rated opening of all time. And I need to double check this, but I believe this is the widest release we've ever seen for an R-rated film of all time in 4,103 theaters. I'll have to double check that one, but I believe that is also in the mix here. We've also got, of course, it's the biggest September opening of all time, because again, the previous record was 49 million, and actually opening day, the film, it made 51 million, so that crushed it immediately. And then also with a New Line record for biggest opening for their company, if you include The Hobbit, that was like, 85 million roughly? Again, destroys that one. And then also, it's the biggest movie opening for a horror film. Now, if you look back, I looked at a couple different ones. For an R-rated horror film, the third Paranormal Activity made about 53 million, or somewhere in that 50 to $55 million range. I don't have the exact numbers up in front of me here. And then also another thing too was Signs. If you count that as a horror movie, it was a PG-13 horror movie. Yeah, some people will consider it more of a sci-fi, but I wanted to include that one as well, because that got 60 million, a little over 60 million. And if that $124 million prediction comes true, then this has doubled that number, and it has more than doubled the number from Paranormal Activity 3. This is really unheard of in Hollywood. Now, I'm not sure if I can put a finger on exactly what it was that made this movie not just the biggest movie of all time here in the fall and the biggest, opening of all time for a horror movie and so on, but what made a movie that was originally projected at 40 million balloon, so to speak, because there's a lot of balloons in the movie, open to close to $120 million, at tripling its initial forecast. I don't know. We haven't seen a case like that before, to my knowledge, with a big movie that's already got such high expectations. expectations. I mean, sure, every once in a while we have a movie like The Avengers, which some people projected would get to like 160 million opening weekend, clear back in the day, and it cleared 200 million for its domestic opening weekend. And there's other examples like that, like Star Wars. I think the Force Awakens, by the way, we're talking here. That one, some people said it would only open to like 150, and that, of course, got to close to 250 million. So that might be the best one. I mean, some people were saying 200 million, so that one, give or take which source you were looking at, but that one was, again, a really large number. I can't think of another example like this. Now, of course, I think the thing that helps it being such a big overperformer this weekend was that the last 4 weeks have been absolute shit at the box office. I mean, pretty much from The Dark Tower on, the next few weeks, with the exception of Annabelle Creation, which made about 36 million, every other August release, again with the possible exception of Hitman's Bodyguard, every other release really was a stinker. Unless we get to like Wind River, which was an independent movie, which eventually got into wide release, and now that one has actually done really well and has cleared $25 million, at least by the initial projections here. And we've had movies like Logan Lucky, which did not perform very well. The Dark Tower did not perform extremely well. The Nut Job 2 did not do well. You know, pretty much the only August release that's done well that really matched expectations or went beyond them was Kidnap. But I think a lot of that was just because expectations were so basement level lows. And then it actually made like 30 million. And now it's, and I think it was originally projected to make like 8 million total. So that's why that one is probably the most profitable movie of the summer when you look at that regard. But seriously, that is a big contributor there. It's also the fact of the national mood of the country right now, because to a degree, and of course some people have already speculated on this, because we have had such a disastrous situation going on both in Texas and in Florida, with Hurricane Harvey, of course, in Texas, and Hurricane Irma now hitting Florida, that, several, thousands, millions of people have been evacuated and all that. And not to say that every last person that was going to go see it down in those areas was evacuated, because I'm sure they have a lot more important things going on in their life. They're not really worried about a horror movie opening up. They're worried about, are our lives going to be destroyed by the time we get back to our home? Is anything going to be left of our home by the time we get back? So it wouldn't surprise me if there was a little bit of conflict there with that. But there are some people projecting the opening could have been closer to like 130, maybe 140 million if everything was all right. But at the same time, I have to kind of disagree there and kind of say that the national mood right now is very much, this is a disaster, that it's a good escape vehicle. It's a great way for people to go to the movies, because they haven't been to the movies in a while. We've seen that with the box office. People have not been going to the movie theaters lately because there's evidently nothing that catches their fancy out, with the exception of maybe some people like me who like some of the independent films, like Wind River was one. I was dying to see it and I loved it. And there's a couple other ones like that. But with those exceptions, and Annabelle Creation being the other one, fans who like to go to movies regularly have had no reason to go to the theaters lately. And they've had a lot of excuses to stay home. Now we get a big film like this, which was hotly anticipated. A lot of people have read the book. A lot of people love Stephen King. A lot of people got freaked out. And the trailers also are a big part of this. And the marketing campaign and the social media campaign surrounding the kids, and every one of the kids, and actors, directors, writers, producers, etc. Everybody who had those social media accounts who were saying and putting up all this great buzz about the movie, they really helped. And we're beginning to see this in social media, like the Star Wars, that had an Instagram trailer go up that was not released on YouTube, I believe, or it was, later, much later. But we're beginning to see that social media does really impact movies in a big way sometimes, as far as opening weekend numbers and stuff. And I think that was a big part of it, because personally, I don't use social media a whole bunch, but I've heard a lot of people nonstop talking about how, when they were shooting the movie especially, how some of the young actors would really put up a lot of photos and stuff, and they would really, really get the attention of everybody who likes to look on that stuff whenever the topic came up when they were shooting the movie or when it was getting close to release and all that. They were talking about how the kids really had a great social media presence and how they were really promoting the movie in a positive way. So that adds to it, plus the fact that, Stephen King, even though some of his adaptations don't exactly go to plan, and some of them you're better off reading the book, this is one that people have been waiting for years to see it being adapted to the big screen. And going back to like 2008, 2009, I think they started putting initial projects together. Then Cary Fukunaga came on board a few years ago. That fell apart. And Andre Muschietti came aboard and ended up directing it and everything. And he did a marvelous job with the movie. I think that regardless of how this movie would have turned out, I think it would have been record breaking for that September movie, unless it was an absolute crap film and nobody liked it. Then we're talking maybe 30 million, but it would still do well, and it would still kind of turn the box office around at this point if everything else had played out the way it has. It's hard to put an exact reason on why the numbers are this high. And I do think the main contributors there are the campaign for the film, the marketing campaign, social media campaign, etc. Also, the fact that, yeah, the last 4 weeks have been so low at the box office that Forbes and all these other Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all these big newspapers who don't normally talk about movies all the time are talking about what's going on in Hollywood and why is this such a bad situation for the people whose jobs rely on box office dollars? Why is this such a problem and all that? Now we have the complete opposite to talk about, how a movie comes out that's, again, originally projected at 40 million. All of a sudden it's making close to $120 million opening weekend. We don't know the final numbers yet. It might go over that. And it is such an event, too. I think that was part of it, too, was once the initial word came out, and it was kind of earlier on in this week. We'll get back to this in a minute here with reviews, because some people have made some very outrageous claims that I disagree with 100%. But once those reviews started coming out and saying, no, this is a really great, maybe top 5 of all time adaptation of Stephen King's novels, that I think really kind of became the event movie, which happens. And again, of course, the national mood and everything, we want some escape from the weather and everything that's happening down in the southern part of the country there. I think it's just a perfect storm that all came together for this movie. And I was saying on Movie Blogger at least a few weeks ago, if you're a Wall Street person and you're really interested in the stocks and stuff, put some money into Time Warner, because their stocks are going to skyrocket after this if the movie does 70, 75, 80 million and it starts breaking all these records. Well, not only has it broken those records, it has absolutely smashed those records and is now looking at being one of the highest grossing films of the year. Now, if you would have told me months ago that it was going to be number one, the highest grossing film of this, time frame, I would have believed you. If you would have told me 117 million, I would have said, oh, is that how much it made total? And then you would have told me it was that opening weekend number. I would have said you're absolutely dead wrong and I don't believe you. And if you had told me that it was going to beat the opening weekend numbers for Wonder Woman and for all these other big, a lot of other big summer blockbusters, it could potentially beat the numbers for Spider-Man Homecoming as well. It's very close to one of the top openings of the year. I would have told you you're crazy. I mean, this is really, I think, going to be one of the biggest news stories of the year with movies, and especially with box office numbers, with the exception of maybe Beauty and the Beast, because that one did very, very well back in spring. But yeah, this is totally insane. And yeah, let's get to this. I had this other point here. The reviews started coming in on the movie back to, I think it was Monday or Tuesday or so. And that was when they had an initial screening a couple weeks ago for some of the Hollywood, LA, and then also some of the New York critics, and they really liked it, and the initial reviews were very positive. So then the full embargo lifts and full written reviews are available starting, I think it was Monday night or Tuesday morning, whatever it was, of this previous week. And yeah, again, a lot of glowing reviews, and rightfully so, because I think it is a very great film. One of the better films of the year, actually, when I think about it. Maybe not like absolute, gonna be top 10 material, but it's definitely one of the greater entertainments so far this year. So here's the thing, is a lot of people are stupidly pointing at this projection that if the embargo had been lowered, say a week or 2 weeks ago, that the movie would have been even higher. I call bullshit on that. I do not think that's the way that these box office numbers go. I think it's actually the exact opposite. Let's look at a couple examples here, and these are both superhero movies, so there's not going to be an exact correlation between horror and superhero here, but let's look at these two examples here. And again, the embargo is not going to be 100% of the reason for why the numbers ended up being what they were for both cases, but let's take a look here. So Wonder Woman. That movie originally projected like close to 55 million or 60 million, which is what Thor and the first Captain America movie opened at. And then some of the high in the sky projections were saying 85 million. Now, what I think really helped Wonder Woman was not just the fact that it was a good movie. It was the fact that the embargo lifted at the perfect time, because the movie opened right after Memorial Day. And it was actually on Memorial Day or the morning after, that Tuesday, whatever it was. Kind of the similar case with it. That was when the embargo lifted and the reviews were very positive. And that was really what got skeptics like me, who were saying, I don't trust Warner Brothers, I don't trust what they're doing with their DC properties, I'm going to sit this one out. until I actually hear that people really love it and it's more than just DC fans. And then the reviews came out, and that's when I kind of got turned, so to speak, from the dark side to the light side, if you want to look at it that way. That was it. It was when those reviews came in, and they came in on Monday or Tuesday right before the movie opened. It wasn't like they came in 2 weeks before. And I think that's what fueled the box office, was the fact that the reviews came in at just the perfect time when skeptics like me could say, oh, wait a minute, this movie's coming out in a couple days, but it's getting some of the best reviews of the year. Okay. And that's, I think, what helped fuel the box office there. Now, turn the calendar back a year to Captain America Civil War back in 2016. That came out in the first weekend of May. But the review embargo was lifted, I want to say 2 or 3 weeks before. Or the initial critic screenings, I believe, were 3 weeks shy. Or maybe 4 weeks shy. It was a long time before the movie was in theaters, here in the States at least. I know it did open in some foreign markets in the end of April, but it opened here in the States in the first weekend of May, and they had the first reaction. The movie was done early. They were ready to show it. They were proud of it for a good reason. Again, it's a really spectacular movie. And they had the embargo down like 3 weeks before, maybe 2 weeks before, whatever it was. It was a long way out. And again, the reviews were very, very positive, and a lot of people calling it one of the best films of the Marvel Universe. But here's the thing. Then the box office projectionists started to say, okay, the numbers are so high on this that we're raising them. Because at the time, people were saying, 160, maybe 170 million would be tops. And that's actually closer to what it ended up doing. But then the analysts came in and said, no, it's going to crack 200 million. It's going to get close to the Avengers numbers. And some projections even had it at $210 million. Because the embargo was lifted so early and because so many people got excited for it. But as time went on, and I think the embargo was lifted too early, then the buzz kind of started to die out a little bit right before the movie opened. And even though it is a Marvel movie, and Marvel is, of course, one of the biggest draws of any box office in, the last like 20 years or so. But I think the review embargoes were lifted way too early, and it affected the box office. I think it did. If those embargoes had been up, say, a week or a week and a half before, I think that would have really fueled the box office there, and maybe it could have gotten another 10 or 15 million just from the pure excitement of people who just hear about it lately. If you hear about it 2 weeks before, sometimes it leaves your head and you forget about it by the time the movie comes out. And then the movie comes out and it's past the opening weekend and you're like, oh yeah, that's right, because you see an ad for it on TV or something. You're like, oh yeah, that's right, I heard great things about it. Oh, it's out, that's right. And you've forgotten about it. So with something like Wonder Woman, it's right there in your face and the movie opens in 2 days. It's kind of hard to forget about it. But with Captain America Civil War, that was like 3 weeks before. And I think that really affected it. If those screenings had been a week later or 2 weeks later, we're talking probably, 200 million would have been in range, because it would have been at the forefront. People would have remembered it. It would have been a big, big deal. But as it turned out, it was just a really well-reviewed movie that was great, but the box office could have been higher if they would have paid attention to that time frame, I think, a little closer. So, with all these people saying that it could have gotten to 150, 160 million if the embargo had been down earlier, I disagree 100%. We've got a lot of other examples I can go to, like Star Wars, The Force Awakens. That was one, the embargo lifted literally 2 days or like 48 hours, whatever it was, before the first screenings began for the public. And that, again, was at the forefront. Right before the movie opens, great reviews coming out of all the various sites. That helps. And I think that was another thing that triggered a lot of the skeptics, because there were skeptics of The Force Awakens. But once they read all the great reviews saying it is the best Star Wars movie in 30 years and so on and so forth, that was what I think really brought that home for people to go see it opening weekend. Yeah, if you are saying that, the embargo hurt it, I don't think so. I think it helped it. I think it actually was the exact opposite. So I do hope that this does become the case here going forward, that people who are running Disney, who are running Sony, who are running all these other Paramount and Universal, who are, who also do these embargo lifts 2 or 3 weeks early, sometimes it can't help it. Like American Made is a recent example here. It's going to come out here in the States in a couple weeks, but it already is playing in a few foreign markets, including the UK. So there are reviews out for that one, but that's because it's already opened overseas. You can't tell people over there not to post reviews because it's not out in the US yet. There's a lot of legal tape that goes through that, so you can't do that. That's, you can't help it if it's that case. But it is being released pretty much worldwide all at the same time here, or relatively close. There's a couple markets that I think will open it later, for the most part, this was a one and done opening weekend on the worldwide scope. And it is close to 180 million, including all the foreign markets here for its global worldwide opening weekend, which for a horror movie, again, that is phenomenal, record breaking business. There's a lot of other movies who open on that great big worldwide scale who do not do those kind of numbers. Yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time on this, but it's going to be one of the biggest news stories of the year in movies, and especially in box office, was how this little horror movie, so to speak, it's only 35 million production budget, so it's not like it was a gigantic film. There's no A-list stars in this. They're all kids, or, Bill Skarsgård, who is not a household name by any means. And again, I think it's the social media effect really helped it, and they really helped us introduce to these kids who are terrific in the movie as well. But there's just a perfect storm of events here that led to this massive opening, and we're seeing it now. I doubt we're ever going to see anything like this again in the horror market, because once another movie in the horror world, maybe the sequel to it, because there is going to be a second one, when the second one comes out, there might be an expectation for the movie to also equal those numbers. It might not, but I doubt it's going to, because it was such a perfect storm this time. Now, we'll see what happens next time, but the full court press marketing might be on again, and we might get, a similar number here, but I doubt it's going to be this. And of course, it's not going to be as surprising next time because the first one did it. And I don't know how you're going to do a horror movie that's going to equal these numbers in the future where it's going to be such a surprise, because you can look back and say, well, it did it, and so on and so forth through, the next generation of horror movies. You were never going to see a opening like this again where it was such a perfect storm, where it blew the roof off of so many expectations. Just to kind of, bring it home, we're never going to see anything like this again as far as setting these records like this and being such a big story. Next time it's going to be, well, we can look at this example, but there's never been an example like this with horror movies before. Okay, so now that we're all done with that, let's move on. Home Again. This also opened this weekend, and again, we've just got the initial numbers here, but it's a little over 9 million. Now, I'm actually a little surprised. Now, I did not think this movie was going to come anywhere close to getting that number one spot. No way. But I was thinking, the woman audience at the box office really has been lacking here in the past few months. I mean, Girls Trip was one where, obviously there's a lot of guys who went to see it too, but that one, was aiming for the female demographic, really landed and made a lot of money. It was the highest grossing comedy that's not animated and not also a superhero movie of the summer. And it did extremely phenomenal business. But since then, there really hasn't been a movie that's aimed at that female demographic that is advertised in that way. And, not to call it a chick flick by any means, because to a degree, I think that is kind of degrading to the female audience to say only chick flicks are going to be aimed at the female demographic. Of course not. There's chicks and girls, whatever you want to call them, they'll go see any movie as long as it's good and, if they've got the appetite for it. And of course, every man, every woman is different in that regard. But all that aside, Home Again, at least from the advertising and the filmmakers involved and Reese Witherspoon's starring status there and everything, it just felt like a movie like Girls Trip, which is aimed at that demographic that is going to hit it big with that demographic. So I was thinking, projections are low because they were about 7 million. I was thinking, no, it'll probably be closer to 11 or 12 million. And we have seen other movies like that do similar numbers, but only at 9 million. Now, of course, it's in less than 3,000 theaters. That kind of hurts a little bit. Plus, we had it very much overperforming. I mean, more than overperforming, in some indications, doubling its expectations. And I know that horror movies are very popular for dates. And so, maybe some of the girls who were going to see Home Again got dragged into seeing it instead by their boyfriends or other girlfriends. So, that's a case, too, where I think it hurt Home Again. Now, at the same time, I do not think 9 million is a bad number. Now, since its projections were so low at, 8 or 7 million, in that regard, maybe it did overperform ever so slightly. But it's definitely something where I thought the female demographic, the female audience, who really haven't had a film targeted at them in a big way, I thought they would really turn out for this one, but it wasn't quite the case. Again, a lot of that might have to do with the fact that it really overperformed, and maybe a lot of those who would normally go to see Home Again opening weekend instead went to see it. That could be the case. But this is one I was kind of surprised that it only hit 9 million. Now, as far as these two movies in the future, like I said, if it holds on and if it does the opposite of what a lot of horror movies do, because some horror movies open, they make like 75% of their total box office numbers in the opening weekend, and then the rest of it just kind of falls by the wayside. If it does that, it's still going to be close to 200 million when we're all said and done. Now, with Home Again, yeah, a lot of these movies that are targeted in this way, so-called chick flicks, do tend to hold well at the box office and only fall like 30, 40, 50% or less each weekend until it gets to like a month or 2 months in. So it could actually do really well in the next coming weeks. But if it holds on and actually does like maybe a 50% drop or a little under 50% next weekend, and it will have some direct competition with Mother. There's a couple other movies opening up, but I don't see it falling below that number one mark. We could be looking at 300 million plus here, just in the same way that Wonder Woman opened to 100 million and then went on and really stayed the course and got to 400, and now it's up to over 410 million. Now, I don't know if we're going to see numbers that high for it, but we'll see, because it is a long ways to Halloween, and we don't really have another big horror movie opening. Well, we do have Mother, but that's going to be in a somewhat limited release, not as big as it. But we've got Happy Death Day coming out in the middle of October. I think it's Friday the 13th, actually. So that might be one where that helps a little bit. And then we've got the Jigsaw movie, next journey in the Saw franchise coming out, and that's actually coming out right on Halloween or right before. But it, I think, will be the horror movie that people check out from now until we get that Jigsaw movie. And again, Happy Death Day will have its place, Mother will have its place at the box office, but they're not going to come close to what it is doing. I think it will be a movie that people either go back to see again and again, or that people who don't always go out to the opening weekend crowds, who hear about the movie, hear people love it, they're going to go out and check it out here in the next couple weeks, and especially when we get closer to Halloween, Warner Brothers might actually do a bigger push and put it back into more theaters to get even more money, because it's, of course, we all know everybody's in it for the money. All right, so the other big topic we're going to talk about today, another kind of big story here lately, and this actually broke late last week, was we've got more trouble in the world of Star Wars with directors. Now, Colin Trevorrow has been removed, fired, quit, whatever you want to believe, from Star Wars Episode 9. Now, of course, we kind of went through this when Phil Lord and Chris Miller got removed from the Han Solo movie, but J.J. Abrams, when he went on, had a relatively smooth experience with directing. There's some interviews that have come out since that said maybe he had a couple ideas that didn't get involved. Plus, there was stuff like he got injured on set, Harrison Ford got injured on set, but it wasn't really a big deal. Then Rogue One comes out, and of course, all the reshoots have to happen on that, and we, heard about it, back in July or whatever it was. And, reports have varied on how much of that film got reshot, but evidently there was still a lot of work to be done right before the movie came out. Episode 8, so far with Rian Johnson, we haven't heard any negative word on it, with the exception of, obviously, when Carrie Fisher passed, maybe that affected a little bit of the story and a little bit of maybe some ADR and a little post-production work that had to be done, but for the most part, everything was done with Princess Leia. They just had to change some stuff for maybe Episode 9, depending on how far they were going to go with the character. Then Phil Lord and Chris Miller happened. And of course, that's a catastrophe in the world of movie making. It's very rare for anything like that to happen. But we also overlooked it a little bit. We thought, oh wait, Josh Trank, that's right. He was going to do a Boba Fett standalone movie. But with Fantastic Four, everything that happened there, he got removed from that project, and that whole thing ended up being put on the shelf. And now with Colin Trevorrow. So this marks, count them up. If you count Phil Lord and Chris Miller, that's 2 directors. 3 with Josh Trank, 4 for this one for Colin Trevorrow, and 5 if you want to include Gareth Edwards, who was not involved directly in all of the reshoots of Rogue One. That's 5 out of 7 directors who have had to been replaced, fired, have quit, or had to be put aside for a little while in order to fix the movie or to finish the movie. That is incredible. I think people are not taking this the way that they should be. And not to sound like I'm going to, really target anybody here, but I don't think we have anybody else to blame here other than Kathleen Kennedy. Because here we go. When you look at a problem, you have to look at what is the underlying factor, what is the constant that is happening here. And the constant, without a doubt, is Lucasfilm and its leader, Kathleen Kennedy. Because Kathleen Kennedy is the one pulling the plug on Phil Lord and Chris Miller's contracts, getting them out. She's the one saying, hey, we're done with you, Josh Trank, and we're done with this, at least for the moment, done with this Boba Fett movie. Okay, Gareth, we're going to let somebody else direct these reshoots, and you're not going to be as heavily involved, yanking him out for a little bit. And now with Colin Trevorrow, depending on how this comes out, and of course maybe he just didn't want to do the movie anymore. Of course, we're not going to know the full story on this until potentially years down the road, if ever. I don't know if we'll ever get a tell-all book about what's happening here, but under the assumption that Trevorrow was out because of the Book of Henry and all these other situations and everything else that's come out here lately, then yeah, she is the constant in these situations. So yeah, if we go on that assumption, then yes, she is the one to blame for hiring these directors, or at least, engaging in these directors, like the case of Josh Trank, even though he probably never officially got to the point where he was doing a lot of stuff. I mean, obviously, the movie had not begun shooting, the movie had not begun a lot of its pre-production stuff yet, but there was still that thing where he had to be removed from the project. It's not like the Phil Lord and Chris Miller situation, but it's definitely something to where he was out, and had to be pushed out, in other words. So, in my opinion, yeah, that means that she is to blame for not hiring the right people, or for realizing too late, in the case of Phil Lord and Chris Miller, that a mistake has been made and that we hired the wrong people. And that's going off the assumption that Phil Lord and Chris Miller were just doing the wrong things or not going by the script. And again, we don't know the full story on that, but we're going to eventually find that out eventually. I think when Phil Lord and Chris Miller do get interviewed about this eventually, when the press feels like it's enough time has passed, maybe we'll get a 100% different story than what Kennedy and some of the other reports have come out and said, which was that they just didn't like what Phil Lord and Chris Miller were doing, that they were doing the Ace Ventura stuff. So in that case, that leads me to believe, if all these other things are true and all these constants are here with Kathleen Kennedy, is it time for Kennedy to move on? And it's a place where I think Bob Iger has to consider that, because if you don't know, Bob Iger is the head of Disney. He's the one who's really overseeing Kennedy and Kevin Feige and John Lasseter, who are the heads of all their different offshoot projects. In other words, that's Pixar for John Lasseter, and of course Kevin Feige is in charge of Marvel stuff. And Bob Iger, if he's got a problem with these people, at any point, he can yank the plug on them and say, "You're fired, get out of here, we're going to replace you." And, when we look at the history here, Pixar, they've, of course, there have been a couple of scandals here through the years. There's been projects that have been on the books that are, suddenly gone, or projects that have had to be moved around in the schedule a little bit. But every major studio has that. Every major production company has that. Same goes with Marvel. There have been cases, especially when we get to directors and stuff, like Ava DuVernay was in talks to do Black Panther, but she didn't get fired from it. Not the way Phil Lord and Chris Miller did, and potentially the way Trevorrow was. And it's not like when Patty Jenkins was on board to direct Thor 2, she kind of realized herself that things were not going to work out, so she left the project, at least according to the testimony that she's given and all the other stuff. While Marvel and Pixar both have had their days, and every studio and every production company has their days, but this is one where it's like, okay, you had a bad week and then a bad month in this case. And I think it's starting to become a problem, and it starts to become this thing to where, okay, so now are we going to hear in the next few weeks that Stephen Daldry is no longer interested in directing Obi-Wan Kenobi, because they're going to do the Obi-Wan Kenobi movie. Maybe he's done. Maybe Kathleen Kennedy is just, trigger happy right now. But it's to this point now where it's happened enough times, or enough stories have come out and stuff, to where Kennedy is becoming the constant in these situations. Now, personally, she has been a big deal and a big involvement in some of the greatest films of all time and some of the highest grossing films of all time. So I definitely do not think that she's a talentless hack by any means. I know some people have been painting her out to be that, but I completely disagree with that point. Now, also, we have to suggest here, if that is the case, why hasn't Disney done anything about it yet, with Bob Iger and some of the higher-ups? Well, I think I have the answer there. It's because Star Wars is still one of the most profitable, if not the most profitable, film franchise that's still going at this point. Force Awakens made over $2 billion. Rogue One made over $1 billion. She is 2 for 2 in the money department, and as far as quality of the films go, Force Awakens was good, Rogue One was good, then, you're 2 for 2 in that front too. It's not like she's all of a sudden, making bad movies or overseeing bad films. No. And they're losing money. No. That's not the case. That why she hasn't been removed yet, or why discussions have not really started yet, because she's 2 for 2 so far, and every sign is pointing to The Last Jedi making that 3 for 3 in both cases. Now, here's the deal. Now, in the next few years, if Episode 9 comes out and it turns out to be a mistake, that Trevorrow was the right guy, and whoever they get to replace him, whether that's Rian Johnson again, or JJ, Steven Spielberg, all these other names that are being bandied about, Tom Hooper has been heard a few times, Jon Favreau, among others. If they come out and do a movie that's less than satisfactory and doesn't make as much money, then people say, oh, okay, so that was Kennedy's fault because she let go of Trevorrow, suppose if everything in that turns out to be true. And that's kind of the big caveat here, is if all of that turns out to be true. And again, we don't know the full story yet. And then, of course, everything with Han Solo right now going on. if Han Solo comes out and it's a mistake, it's a 100% failure, then yeah, Kathleen Kennedy is going to be to blame there because she was the one that put two guys off of it and then brought on Ron Howard. And the same goes like, yeah, if Obi-Wan Kenobi comes out and Stephen Daldry does not direct it or something else happens there, then we can again point to Kathleen Kennedy. That is, I think, the point when all of a sudden she has to go. But until then, we have to say, let's be careful here. I think we have to say, let's be watchful here, because if Kathleen Kennedy continues to do this and continues to either, number one, fire people for the sake of firing people and bring on other people just because they're hotter, or because she's had a change of heart or whatever for any dumb reason and not a logistical one like what was happening supposedly with Phil Lord and Chris Miller, that's a different thing. Or another part of this could be that she is really not far-sighted enough to know that, hey, hiring this person at this time is a great deal, but they're not going to work out. And obviously, to a degree, there is only so much you can do to prepare for that. There's no knowing for sure if Phil Lord and Chris Miller, again, if they're doing this Ace Ventura stuff, there's no knowing for sure, months before you hire them, that they're going to do what they're going to do. But if you have that really lack of farsightedness to know that once you hire these guys or girls, what you're getting is what you're getting. If you fail to realize that, that becomes a big problem, because we can't have this going on. Bob Iger and those higher-ups at Disney cannot have this keep happening. It can't be like, not to make a really rough comparison here and to put DC down again, but as I have done in the past, but in the way that DC still to this day is having trouble making sure that all the news that comes out is positive and making sure that they have damage control and everything. It seems every day we're getting reports on whether or not Ben Affleck is still Batman, on what's happening with Justice League, on what's happening after Aquaman and after Shazam, and what's going to happen to all these Joker movies and everything else that's happened here in the past few weeks and the past months as far as concerns and contradictions and stuff. Oh boy, it's still a mess over there. But I think Disney and Bob Iger and them, they don't want that. Obviously, nobody wants that. They don't want that level of contradictions coming out every day or every week or however often it's coming out now. They want a smooth ship. They want smooth sailing on these waters as we get into each film. They cannot keep having this, because if this does keep happening for the next couple of Star Wars entries in films, television, whatever, if Kennedy is consistently that constant and is always the one doing the firing or hiring the wrong people, whatever happens there, eventually she's got to go. And again, I'm not trying to bully her here, but it's just that we have to look at the constants here. And if we look at the constants in Warner Brothers, as far as their reports varying and all that stuff, and everything that's happening over there, it seems like the constant there was that there was no one person running the show. Now, at this point, we've had various people say, well, they're kind of running the show, whether that's Zack Snyder or whether that's Kevin Fujihara, I think that's his name, but he was a big producer on some of the last DC entries there. But we've heard various reports of all these different people that are going to be trying to be that Kevin Feige, that Kathleen Kennedy, that John Lasseter, kind of big, large and in charge person that's really overseeing everything and calling all the shots. Now, of course, like I said, with DC there and with Warner Brothers, that could all change tomorrow, and all of a sudden it's a smooth sailing again, and we're back to, a lot of the stuff that's happening with Marvel now, where it's very rare to hear about problems with Marvel, and it's pretty rare to hear about stuff that's happening with Pixar that's in the negative light, unless it's negative reviews and negative box office. But this cannot keep happening for Star Wars. Another kind of deal there, again, I'm kind of repeating myself here, but if this keeps happening with the next couple projects, I think they're going to realize Kathleen Kennedy is the one who's either not farsighted enough to know who she's hiring when she's hiring them, or is just really, the one who's having second thoughts too constantly and always bringing on different people at the wrong point. Now, of course, there's a big difference here between what happened with Trevorrow and what happened with Lord and Miller, because with Lord and Miller, they were fired right as the movie was just about done shooting. With Trevorrow, pre-production has begun, and filming is not set to begin for another couple months on episode 9. But still, there are various scenes and scripts and everything else that Trevorrow has overseen, including potentially some of the pre-production stuff. We don't know for sure, of course. But regardless, this guy has been on this project for a long time, and there's a lot of stuff that he's overseen so far. Again, we're not to the shooting degree yet, but there's a lot of stuff that he has signed off on and stuff that he has agreed on with all the other people working on the movie. So there has to be some changes made here once they get that new director. And now, of course, we can speculate all day as to who the new director is going to be. I don't think we have time for that today. Anyway, so one more thing I wanted to quickly bring up here while we're on this subject here is I am reading reports now about why Trevorrow could have possibly been fired. Now, again, I haven't made up my mind 100% on what happened here, but just going off that assumption that he was fired, one of the reasons I'm hearing for why he's being fired is not what I suspected. I suspected all the reports, and some of these reports are complete bogus and people who just want to rant. A lot of the reports that I was suspecting to read would say that because the Book of Henry did so poorly and all that, which, you know what, I saw the movie, and again, a few months ago, you can actually go back and listen to one of my podcasts, I kind of defended the movie, but I defended the fact that he was going to direct it because of how he did the movie, and how the movie was directed, and how the movie was written, because I think he did have a hand in the screenplay as well. I think he had a couple other writers within there. But I did not think that was going to be the reason to why he was leaving the project. Now, since then, these are not the reports I'm reading. Instead, I'm repeating that he is being egotistical on set and really praising himself because Jurassic World did very well. Now, again, this could be true, and if it is true, it happened. But, kind of the same way back when I was kind of defending Colin Trevorrow when I said that Book of Henry is not going to be the reason why he leaves, maybe it did turn out to be the reason. And if that is, okay, you've called my, not to say bluff, but you've called me on that one. And with this one, I just don't believe this for a minute. Now, of course, when stars, directors do interviews, and I've seen various interviews with Colin Trevorrow, and he seems like the sweetest guy on the planet. And he seems like the brightest bulb in the pack and the sharpest crayon, whatever you want to say. He brings humor to it. He's very happy, very jovial, and he's glad to be there. Now, of course, when these people do interviews, sometimes they're putting on a face. Obviously, some do it better than others. If you've seen some of the, really awkward reviews and interviews out there, there's, some stars just don't handle it well. But Trevorrow evidently does, or he is true to who he is. And I just don't buy anything into that thing of him being egotistical. Now, of course, it could have happened. If it did, then yeah, he has to kind of settle himself down here because, yeah, Jurassic World made $1.5 billion plus. He was not the reason for it, though. The reason for it was because it was in the Jurassic Park universe and because people, I guess, had that hungering to see a new project in the universe. I think it had so much less to do with who the director was and more to do with the subject matter. Anybody could have directed that movie. It probably would have done close to what it did or maybe even more. But I just think that some of these reports and the way they've been written and the way I've read them, the way they've been kind of lumped together and everything, it just sounds like people are just doing that to say that and to rant and to make up stuff to get all those clickbait stuffs. And I just don't believe it. And another thing we have to consider here, Frank Marshall is the husband of Kathleen Kennedy. So when Kathleen hired Trevorrow to direct episode 9, it was after Jurassic World had come out. Frank Marshall was a producer on Jurassic World. So he had seen Trevorrow in action. And, Frank Marshall, for the most part, is a producer who is on set most of the time. He's not one of the, Steven Spielberg, where they sign off on a couple things, maybe they say hi to somebody, and they're counted as an executive producer, But Frank Marshall, he's an on-set producer. He's a guy who's there, who's overseeing everything. Even though he was only an executive producer on the last 2 entries of the Indiana Jones trilogy, that's Temple of Doom and Last Crusade, he was still on set a lot of the time, even though Robert Watts took over as the main producer on those films. So with that, he's married to Kathleen Kennedy. He's going to tell Kathleen Kennedy if he's got a big head. I just don't believe these reports at all because they just sound so unfounded and so untrue. And again, Frank Marshall is a smart guy. And he's married to Kathleen Kennedy, who's in charge of Lucasfilm. If there was a problem, if he were to say to her, hey, I don't think you should hire this guy, I just worked with him on this movie, and now he's really kind of turned himself into a big-headed guy who thinks that all the success that happened was because he was in the director's chair, I think Marshall would tell his wife, of all people, especially when she's in charge of Lucasfilm, hey, if I've got a problem with this guy, I'm going to say don't hire him. And as everything we've heard from various reports going back years, they've pretty much, and they being Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy, have called Trevorrow one of their golden boys because again, Marshall gave him such great reviews, and of course, he did a great job on Jurassic World and helped make the movie as good as it was. And I happen to really like Jurassic World more than a lot of people do. And again, I might just be coming off in the defense of this guy, even if he is, maybe a bit of a loudmouth, potentially. Again, I don't necessarily believe it, but if it does come out to be true, okay, then I'm defending a loudmouth asshole. But you just don't know, and I just don't believe any of these reports at all. So I'm writing those off because there's so much more evidence that I can think of that I can watch even and say that counteracts everything that those reports say. But I will say, in the case of those being true, if that turns out to be the truth that we learn someday, okay, but I'm just wrong about it, I guess. And I've been wrong about a lot of stuff. All right, well, I know it's gone way over. This is way past the normal length of these podcasts. But since I've been gone for so long, and some of these stories do have so much detail to them and so much layered stuff, like this Star Wars stuff probably would have gone on for as long as it has. The It stuff was major, so we had to talk about all those kind of big points there. Anyway, so yeah, I do plan to continue doing these podcasts on Mondays and Fridays, unless something significant comes up. I actually have been employed recently. I don't know what my hours are going to be yet, but if those come into conflict, we might have to change things around. We might have to start doing shows on different days. And when I do the show next time, I'm going to have that It review done. You can actually hear my full thoughts and comprehensive thoughts on the movie itself and everything. We've also got the Toronto Film Festival that's still going on now. I wanted to wait until that was over because I didn't want to jump ahead and say, some stuff just off of the early reviews of maybe half the slate that's been played. And we did conclude the Venice and the Telluride Film Festivals, and I kind of like to do a separate video on those in that Oscars at a Glance series I do every year, where we talk about the major festivals, what hit, what really missed, what are our potential early frontrunners come another month and a half or so. And that will be separate, but I do plan, if there's time and if it's a kind of a slower news week, if there's time and stuff, I will do occasionally in these podcasts a couple of Oscar related subjects, whether that's talk about who I think is getting in, any changes I've made, potential upsets and all that stuff. If we get time for it in the weeks to come and stuff, we'll add a little here. But if you're a regular subscriber to my channel who checks out the content for the Oscar discussions and the Golden Globe discussion and stuff, those are going to continue as planned. I'm not going to substitute any of that into the podcast and make you have to listen through all the podcasts to get to my Oscar stuff. That's all going to be still at separate videos. All right, so yeah, like I said, the plan is still to do Mondays and Fridays, and if everything goes according to plan, I'll be back again on Friday. We'll talk about it and actually do a full review of it, and we'll also talk about all the latest movie news, and I think the festival, Toronto, is going to be over by Thursday, and we might have the awards maybe early Friday or maybe afterwards, I don't know. We'll do a little wrap-up there eventually on that, whether that's going to be here at the podcast or not, or whether that's a separate video in the Oscars at a Glance series. That's going to be determined at a later date, but for sure we'll talk about it and do a full review next time. All right, until then, this has been the Plagmanrules Podcast.